Hello, I'm Maureen Nkandu and welcome to Global South Perspective, where we focus on developments in countries that make up the Greater South. Today we look back at the recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which took place in China from the 4th to the 6th of September. FOCAC is the official forum between China and African countries, except for the Kingdom of Eswatini, which has no diplomatic relations with China. The FOCAC was established in the year 2000 and meets every 3 years, alternating between African countries and China. So what really came out of this? Here are a number of countries that meet first with to come up with bilateral agreements, but then also officially as an African bloc meeting with China. And joining us live from Accra to discuss these issues is International Relations and Security Analyst Fidel Owusu. Thank you for your time, Fidel.
Thank you very much for this opportunity on your prestigious platform. The most important thing is that we have to look at the kind of needs on both sides of the relations. And if you talk of both sides, then you are talking of Africa and China. Even though, as you mentioned, there are bilateral relations between China and individual African states before the forum is organized. And so essentially, we are talking about 54 sovereign states, except Eswatini, that have individual needs, resources, national policies, and national interests or foreign policies that need unique attention. And so this means that despite these countries being part of the African Union, they have unique needs, and so they approach China bilaterally, and then China sees this as an opportunity to create a platform where it's seemingly meeting the whole of Africa, but in actual fact, it is meeting countries individually and agreeing on some cooperation, both socioeconomic and sometimes even security-wise. And this is very important.
So then, as a bloc, an African bloc, as you say, as an African Union bloc, there isn't really much that happens. Everything is more or less on a bilateral level. So why then have so many number of countries in one place when these aspects can be discussed at a bilateral level?
So interestingly, we also had, apart from the individual African countries, we also had AU representant in Beijing. This is some of the ironies that we face. And, first of all, I must say that the relations between China and Africa is more of South-South cooperation, in that we didn't have China colonizing any part of Africa when colonization was at its peak, and we had Europe kind of overly exploiting the continent. So China has this kind of historical legitimacy when it comes to relations with Africa. However, as Africans, we've come a long way after decades of independence. And we think that since 1963, when we decided to have a common forum, at least we should have that kind of unanimity when it comes to representation for the continent. But we still have this kind of division, this kind of individual interest. And that is ironic in that we are dealing with one country which is hugely populated in Asia, has one foreign policy, and smaller economies in Africa, or relatively smaller economies in Africa, are meeting to discuss bilateral issues. In fact, this, even though it is South-South cooperation, is quite uneven, in that you can imagine Togo negotiating with Beijing on important issues on politics and economics, and even security. And you realize that it will be quite uneven. And so this brings us to the point where we have to take a critical look about unity, African unity, and the kind of unanimity that we have on the international front.
Yeah, that's a very important point and a very well-known fact, actually, that smaller countries like Togo, as you say, do not have the political economic muscle to, argue and negotiate tangibly on the table with China. And it's been an ongoing discussion that African countries should actually come together as a big bloc, and then that would give them the gravitas that they need. So why has this been so difficult? Because this forum started it's about 14 years ago now, although they meet every 3 years.
For instance, if even we could not do so continentally, the unity is not continentally, we could have achieved something at the regional levels. So perhaps the 6 regional economic communities could have met in Beijing if we couldn't have a continental unity or continental representation. But even at that level, we still have differences. And one of the differences, actually, back to the question, one of the main challenge has been the differences in national interests and approaches to development. If we are well united, China will not say, I wouldn't want to negotiate with United Africa. I don't think so. But China will not also dictate the pace with which you unite. So everything boils down to us. The ball is in our court, and whatever we decide to do is what will carry us into the future.
But some countries would argue, some African countries would argue that when they come back from that meeting in Beijing, they have a number of deals, trade deals, agreements, investment opportunities. And I'm sure a number of them would even showcase some transformative aspects of these agreements that they will have achieved with China at such fora. So then we wouldn't really say then that there's need for that big voice, the United African voice, if at an individual country level, there is some tangible transformation that is happening out of these discussions.
Okay, so let's look at it this way. It comes to resources, and we have one very important resource, or some of these important resources like cobalt and lithium, which is very critical in the electric vehicle industry or the battery industry, as the international community decides to evolve from hydrocarbons to electric or battery technology. Now, these resources are being found in several African countries. So the logic is this, that look, if Ghana has lithium and Zimbabwe has it, and other countries like DRC and others also have it, why don't we come together and have a united front so that when we are negotiating with bigger powers, and not only China, be it the United States, European powers, Russia, and any other power that is more dominant than individual African states, why don't we come together so that we have collective bargaining? That to tell you, like in Africa, maybe you need some retention, some 30% retention of these resources. You add value to it before they leave our borders. But when Zimbabwe has a different voice from that of Ghana and let's say Mali, then there is always that gap where these powers could exploit. Because then when on the negotiating table, the Chinese negotiator is not so much interested in what Africans are getting. It's not so much interested. What their first priority is what China will be getting. China needs the natural resources to feed its industries. So it behoves on the African countries to also negotiate in their interest. So the thing is that if we are collectively doing it, we stand a better chance of gaining much from these negotiations than when we are doing it individually. So the relationship with China has not been zero-sum in favor of China. However, we stand a better chance if we are able to synchronize our interests, our needs, our economic priorities, our scale of preferences, so that we can send a commissioner to Beijing to negotiate on behalf of the continent. For instance, what is the need of the African Continental Free Trade Area where we want to open our borders to each other's market, produce, yet we cannot have a common front when it came to negotiations.
Well, Fidel, Owusu, there are very interesting points there. I've been speaking to international relations and security analyst Fidel Owusu on the recently held FOCAC, which is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation meeting in Beijing. Join us again next time for another topic here on Global South Perspective.